Hi, let me know. Yeah. Drop me a quick hi to let me know if I'm here. I think I am. I can sort of see myself, but my net is glitching on my phone. So I'm unsure if I'm glitching for all of you too. Okay, I don't think I'm glitching. I think I'm here. Hi, I'm Shree. I'm your English educator for grade 11. Um, we meet every day from 7 to 8 p.m. except on Sundays. Today we're going to be doing the second part of a lesson that we started yesterday, which is when our kids die, if we can be together. Um, Sorry, my laptop glitches sometimes. That's one thing that you'll get used to if you come and see me teach. Another thing that you'll get used to is that I generally speak in English because I don't know Hindi. But if you have any questions about anything that I'm saying, then you can just drop a message in the chat, and I will definitely get back to you and let you know, what it is I said, that you understood. If you have any questions, then I'll answer those. I'll be checking the chat every once in a while just to make sure that like everyone is following and everything is clear to you. All of that said, we should get into the lesson because we have quite a bit to do today. Um, Before we get into it, one last thing to tell you, and that is where we ended last time, right? Yesterday we read everything that was going on in Gordon Cook's personal narrative, We're Not Afraid to Die If We Can Be Together. Sorry, I'm not sure what's happening. Yeah, yeah, back where this is supposed to be. And the last thing that we read was that although Walker, the ship had almost capsized, it came back upright, and Gordon is currently struggling to figure out some sort of solution to the fact that the top of the ship is broken and water is pouring into the ship, which means that the ship is getting weighed down and the risks of sinking are very, very high. And now we'll see what he does about it. So we have Larry and Herb, who are the other two characters who are crewmates in this particular ship, and they've been like pumping the water out. But then more problems arose when our hansom started to block up with the debris floating around the cabin and the electric pump short circuited. So they're using these pumps to get the water out of the ship, right? But then their hand pumps, which is manual pumps, you have to like pump it using your hand. Those hand pumps start blocking up because of the debris. Debris is all of those small pieces of the wood that's been destroyed and all of the things that have been destroyed over there. So small destroyed pieces. All of the debris is blocking up the pumps as they're like pumping the water. It's going into the pump and sort of like blocking up the space in the pump that sucks up the water. And the electric pump short circuit, so it entirely stops working. And now the problem is that the water is still there, but they have no way of getting it out. The water level rose rapidly, and so the water level rises again. Back on deck, I found that our two spare hand pumps had been drenched overboard. smart and they've prepared. But unfortunately, even though they took the precaution of like double lashing everything onto the top of the ship, somehow a lot of things have still been washed off by the waves that swept over them. Their hand pumps are gone. The forestay sail, that's that's kind of it's 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 not actually a sail. I think the forestay sail is sort of the support for a sail. It's like a mini mast, like another pole. The jib, which is a triangular sail, the dinghies, which are small boats, and in this case probably the lifeboat, and the main anchor, which is what they use to like stay in a harbor and keep the ship from moving off. All of these things have been like yanked on board. They have a lot of problems because all of these things are missing. But their primary problem right now is the fact that those spare hand pumps are missing. Then I remembered we had another electric pump under the chart room floor. I connected it to an outside and was thankful to find that it worked. But then Gordon remembers that we have yet another pump that is there under the chart room floor. The chart room is the place in which you keep all your navigation maps and things like that. So they have another electric pump there. So he goes, he looks there, so he pulls it out and he connects it to an outside, which is a pipe leading outside the boat. So it basically like sucks up the water and flows it outside the boat. And then he tries it, and it works. These are some of the definitions from the last thing that we read. You can kind of screenshot them if you want to. And one of the first things that we get straight from reading this paragraph is the sort of unpredictability that comes with this story, right? We have something terrible happen, and then something good happen, and then something terrible happen, and then now something good has happened again. And the story is kind of going up and down and up and down and up and down. And this unpredictability is also very telling because very often in some kinds of stories, what we get is, oh, a bad thing happens, and then things become better, and then they stay better, right? But in the middle of crises like this one, very often it isn't that straightforward, right? It isn't that linear. You don't just have a problem which gets fixed. You have a problem, there's somewhat of a solution. Something about the problem comes back, there's somewhat of a solution again, and that up and downness is very common. It's actually how it generally happens in real life, right? So we get the depiction of that here. The night dragged on with an endless, bitterly cold routine of pumping, steering, and working the radio. We were getting no replies to our mayday calls, which was not surprising in this remote corner of the world. So all through the night, they do a series of things again and again. One is pumping the water out, one is steering because they have to keep guiding the ship, and another is working the radio. What does this mean? They're trying to use the radio to send out radio calls to other ships. They're sending out mayday calls. Mayday calls are calls that are asking for help. And although they're sending out these mayday calls, they're getting no responses. And Gordon says that that's actually entirely to be expected because this corner of the world is entirely empty ocean. People don't travel there very often. So nobody is actually around to receive any of their calls. Sue's head had swollen alarmingly. She had two enormous black eyes, and now she showed us a deep cut on her arm. When I asked why she hadn't made more of her injuries before this, she replied, I didn't want to worry you when you were trying to save us all. So, Gordon and Mary's daughter, Sue, her head has swollen. She said, oh, I just bumped my head before. But she clearly, like, more than bumped her head. It's quite a serious injury. It's like got dramatic swelling now, and her eyes are sort of like bruised because of whatever fall she's had. And she has a cut on her arm. And Gordon's like, why didn't you tell us that you had all of these injuries? He's like, why didn't you make more of your injuries? Which means, why didn't you portray them more seriously? Why did you tell us about them as if they were very light? And she says, oh, I didn't want to worry you because you had better things to think about, which was saving all of us. Bunch of themes that we get here. One is that bitterly cold routine that's going on for these people. It's bitterly cold physically, right? The environment is literally cold. They're on the seas, there's a storm going on, but it's also a depiction of the emotional state of these people, which is to say, they must be really exhausted, and yet they have to keep going on. And this is a situation that would make anybody feel both terrified and cold represents that sort of terror, that sort of exhaustion, um, that sort of tiredness. All of it kind of comes together in cold. And one of the things that we get from this paragraph is an insight into the character of Sue. The last time that we saw her, we thought that she was a little bit of a baby, right? She says, "Oh, I got an injury on my head, and it seems to be a very small injury, and there are much bigger things at stake." So the fact that she even brought that up makes her sound like she's just, not really thinking about the fact that so much else is at stake, like she's just complaining. But here we get another perspective on Sue, and that's that she's actually been incredibly thoughtful in that moment when she said, "Oh, I have a bump on my head." We can only sort of dismiss the fact that she said that because she's deliberately downplayed her injury, right? She's deliberately portrayed to us as though it's not important, so that Gordon doesn't end up worrying. So it tells us that Sue is thoughtful, considerate, that she can think ahead enough to see what's important at a particular point of time and act in accordance to what is important. By morning on January 3rd, and remember this began on New Year's Day, um, the pumps had the water level sufficiently under control for us to take 2 hours rest in rotation. So after like hours and hours of pumping, the water level is finally like not threatening anymore, and so these people can finally start taking some rest, and they start taking rest in rotation, which means some of them are awake while the rest of them are asleep. So everyone sleeps for 2 hours at different points of time, but they still had a tremendous leak somewhere below the waterline. And on checking, I found that nearly all the boat's main rib frames were smashed down to the keel. In fact, there was nothing holding up a whole section of the starboard hull except a few covered parts. But they still have a leak somewhere below the waterline. Below the waterline is the place where, let me just draw it for you so that's easier than telling you. So this is the boat. These are the waves. Then the place where the waves kind of hit the boat is the waterline, and Gordon is telling us that there's still a leak somewhere below the waterline. So there is still a leak somewhere here, and he goes and he checks, and he finds out that the keel is the very, very bottom of the ship. And he finds out that in a particular place on the starboard section of the ship, which is the right side of the ship, um, all of the parts of the ship that sort of hold the ship together, the body of the ship, the outside of the ship together, all of it is kind of smashed, right? The main rib frames are nothing other than those sort of foundational like planks that keep the ship together, and all of them are smashed until the keel, until like the very bottom, to the extent that in one segment, all that's like holding up the body of the ship on one side is just a couple of couples. Everything else, all the rest of the wood that should be there holding that segment together, has been smashed into pieces by the wave. So an entire like part of their ship is missing now. We had survived for 15 hours since the wave hit, but Wave Walker wouldn't hold together long enough for us to reach Australia. Their initial plan is to go to Australia, and however, they've gotten like hit by this wave, by this storm, and somehow miraculously they've survived for 15 hours after the wave hit. But Gordon is certain that the ship is going to fall apart before they go to their initial destination, which is Australia. I checked our charts and calculated that there are two small islands a few hundred kilometers to the east. One of them, Ile Amsterdam, was a French scientific base. Our only hope was to reach these pinpricks in the vast ocean. So Gordon kind of looks at all of the maps and he calculates, where can we go to that is not Australia. If we won't make it to Australia, we have to make other plans. where should we go? And he sort of figures out that there are these two small islands that are a couple of kilometers away, a couple of hundred kilometers away, in the east direction. And one of those islands is populated. It's called Ile Amsterdam, which means New Amsterdam, and it's a French scientific base. And because it's a scientific base, it will also have enough facilities and resources that say these people could land there, ask for help, and keep carrying on with their journey, get like treated also. And Gordon realizes that like these two small islands, they're the only hope that Wade Walker and the people on Wade Walker have. They can't like make it anywhere else except that, so they have to somehow make it to these islands. But they are pinpricks in the vast ocean, which means they're very, very small islands, right? And if they're very, very small islands in the really, really big ocean, then the chances of missing those islands is a lot bigger. It's a lot easier to like miss a really small island than it might be to say miss Sri Lanka, but just because like the quantity of landmass that you can like see or chance upon is a lot less. But unless the wind and seas abated so we could hoist sail, our chances would be slim indeed. The great wave had put our auxiliary engine out of action. So the wave has damaged their supplementary engine, and auxiliary engine is your supplementary engine, which means like your backup engine. Um, and this is a sailboat, right? They're on a sailboat, but the sailboat also has an engine that it can use to run when the winds aren't very good and they still need to keep moving. But the engine is now out of action, which means that the only way for them to travel is using their sails. However, the wind is still really bad and the sea is still really fierce. And we know already that if they put up the sails right now, then they're going to be like carried forward really hastily. Um, and so the risk of like putting up their sail is that they don't know what further kind of damage they could face. And so they really need the wind and the sea to like go down before they can like put up the sail. If the wind and the seas don't go down, then the chances that they reach these places is very, very minimal because they have no other way of making the ship move. Abate means like reduce in speed and intensity. These words, if you want to take a screenshot. And the key thing that we really get from this passage is that the immediacy of that crisis is over, right? The wave and all of the water and the threat of sinking, all of it has been handled. All of it is over and done with. They've done fabulously. They've gotten past all of it. But they still have to figure out their future. Um, and their situation is still really sensitive. And they still have to, answer questions like, what do we do now? Where do we go now? And how do we get there? Right? Because their survival isn't assured yet. They've survived for now, but it's a temporary state of wellness, and they still have to make sure that they completely make it out of this situation alive. And for that, what they have to do is adapt their plans. Initially, they had different plans, but in this circumstance, due to the things that have happened to them, they have to change their plans based on the conditions that they're in, based on where they're in, making all of these calculations like Gordon did, and that's like a good like takeaway. Like if you want to think about how to handle a crisis in general, adapt, improvise, do what you can with what you have available. On January 4th, after 36 hours of continuous pumping, we reached the last few centimeters of water. Now we had only to keep pace with the water still coming in. We could not set any sail on the mainland. So on January 4th, this started again a couple of days ago. They've been pumping the water for 36 hours, and then finally, the water level inside the ship is no longer really bad. It's just the last couple of centimeters. And now they only have to keep pace with the water still coming in. What does that mean? It means that waves are still like all around them, right? And there are still like holes in the ship, which means that water is still coming inside the ship. But now they don't have like a backlog of water that they need to get out of. They only need to like pump as fast as that water is coming in, which is a little bit safer for us. We could not set any sail on the main mast. Pressure on the rigging would simply pull the damaged section section of the hull apart. So we hoisted the storm jib and headed for where I thought the two islands were. So you know how they were thinking that the only way for us to get to these islands is using our sails. They realized they can't put up their big sails on the main mast, which is the main pole on which the sails can be put, because um, pressure on the rigging. The rigging is the ropes that you use to kind of put the sail up. But they've realized that if they kind of tighten the rigging, and they put the sail up, then the segment of the hull that is still like holding together, the part of the ship that's still holding together, will also go under pressure and get like entirely destroyed, which means the ship will fall apart. So they can't risk like putting anything on the main mast, and instead they put up like the small like triangular sail, the storm jib that they have, and then they just set sail for the direction where the two islands are, or where I thought the two islands were. Just to say that Gordon can't be certain of where these two islands are. He's just trying to guess based on the chart and his own expertise. Mary found some corned beef and cracker biscuits, and we ate our first meal in almost 2 days. Mary goes and finds some food, and they eat for the first time in 2 days. Um, why have they not eaten for so long? Two reasons, right? One, they were under immense stress and they were really struggling to just keep everybody in the boat alive. So their priority was really not like eating or like sleeping. Their priority was to somehow make it out of the situation. And second of all, a lot of their things have been destroyed, and a lot of their things have been like washed off. And we know that like a bunch of the things that they had underneath, like in their bunks and stuff, have also been floating around in the water. So they probably had to take time out to look for it, which also would have been like time wasted in the moment of like extreme crisis. So they must have waited until now to like finally pause a bit and eat. Yeah, these are some words. But our respite was short-lived. At 4 p.m., black clouds began building up behind us. Within the hour, the wind was back to 40 knots and the seas were getting higher. The weather continued to deteriorate throughout the night, and by dawn on January 5th, our situation was again desperate. So they get this really brief break. But this break, this respite is a break from that kind of intense crisis. But it doesn't last very long. That very evening, clouds start building up again, and the wind starts getting higher, and the pasta and the seas start getting higher again, and the weather like gets worse and worse throughout the night. Deteriorate means continually getting worse. And by dawn on January 5th, their situation is again really bad. They got like half a day off, and then the next morning they're back to being in like the depths of another crisis. When I went in to comfort the children, John asked, Daddy, are we going to die? I tried to assure him that we could make it. But Daddy, he went on, we aren't afraid of dying if we can all be together. You and Mummy, Sue and I. Gordon goes down to comfort his children because it's a bad moment and presumably he thinks they're going to be scared. So he thinks, okay, I should go try to make them feel better. And his son asks him, oh, are we going to die? And immediately Gordon's sort of like, no, no, we're going to be fine. So he thinks that Jonathan is afraid of dying, right? And Jonathan is asking him this out of fear and out of worry. And he thinks that in his role as a parent, what he's supposed to do is make Jonathan feel better. And so he's telling Jonathan, no, we're going to be fine, don't worry, even though he himself thinks, I don't know if we're actually going to be fine at all. Except he's misunderstood Jonathan, right? Jonathan isn't asking him, are we going to die out of some sort of fear? Jonathan is just asking him, like, in a very factual way. He's sort of like, are we going to die? And then he reassures his father and says, oh, even if we can't make it, we're not afraid of dying if all of us are together. So, very, very interesting line. And we'll talk about it. But first, I want to see if you all have any questions. Hello to Aryan and Shana. Can you hear me now? Sorry, I didn't realize I was very low. Let me know if this is better, maybe. I really hope this is better. hope you can hear me. Um, I'm going to go ahead and try to dissect this line for us. What we get here is two things, right? One is a sense of acceptance of death, a lack of like worrying about whether or not like, oh no, I'm going to die, oh no, that's really terrifying. None of that fear is there. And the reason for that, Johnson tells us, is because we're all together, which is one way of saying if we're all together, I feel safe. And another way that we can read it is, well, if all of us die together, then it means that, we go together as a family. And if we're all dying together as a family, then that's okay, because, like, everyone who I love is here with me. And one small good way of looking at it maybe is to think we can all just, like, disappear from this life together. Um, and that's fine. It's a bit of a dark thought, but it's also very, like, it's an expression of love from Johnson, right? Johnson is trying to say, even this terrible thing, which is death, that I could be very afraid of, is not as terrible if you're with me. And this is where our title comes from. When our Free to Die is We Can Be Together. And it's surprising that the title reference comes from the children because the children appear really, really little in the story. But still, whenever they appear, that's when we also get like a glimpse of the emotion in the story, right? In all the other segments, Gordon is very busy telling us about like, oh, this we did, that we did, that we did, this we did. So we're getting a lot of facts, we're getting a lot of information. But when the children appear, we get a glimpse of the feelings that are going on. We get a glimpse of Gordon the parent rather than Gordon the ship captain, and that provides us with some interesting insights of the sort of desperation of the situation. I could find no words with which to respond, but I left the children's cabin determined to fight the sea with everything I had. Gordon doesn't really have anything that he can say to that. He isn't speechless that his son would say something like that to him. But when he leaves, something in him feels reinforced, right? He is all the more determined to like get them through this. When he was actually telling Johnson, "Don't worry, we'll make it out," he is a lot more hesitant. He is a lot more unsure about what's going to happen. But after listening to what Johnson had to say and seeing how his son is okay with even the worst happening, he decides that the worst is not going to happen. Definitely not to his son, who has expressed so much affection for him. Um, and so he is reinforced by his son and the things that his son has said to him. To protect the weakened starboard side, I decided to heave to, with the undamaged port hull facing the oncoming wave, using an improvised sea anchor of heavy nylon rope and two 22-liter plastic barrels of Caricatures. So he decides that they should take action to protect the right side of the ship, which as we know has a lot of holes in it. And he decides to heave to, which means to stop the ship, pause the ship, and turn it around. And what he does is he turns it around so that the undamaged side is what is facing all of those waves that are like really harsh and high. So the weakened side doesn't have to like face the waves that are harsh and risk more damage. And he heaves to or he stops using an improvised sea anchor. They don't have their usual sea anchor to stop and turn the ship. Instead, they use nylon rope and they use like paraffin, which is fuel. They put like bottles at the end of the rope and they put that in the sea and they use that to like weigh them down heavily enough to stop and turn themselves. Um, and again, improvisation is a thing that comes to us here. Adapt with whatever you have available to you. That evening, Mary and I sat together holding hands as the motion of the ship brought more and more water in through the broken surface. We both felt the end was very near. And that evening, he and his wife stood together and they're holding hands and they're watching as the ship moves and more water is coming in through one of those broken segments of the ship. And both of them are feeling quite certain that everything's going to end very soon. The ship is probably going to drown and they're all going to die. Fight the sea is an interesting phrase because it's just that there is a bit of a war going on here, a battle between between these human beings and the ocean. And that ending is something we should pay attention to. We both felt the end was very near, and it would be easy, right, for us to say, oh, they're being really pessimistic. Oh, they're like being very hopeless. Oh, we should be more optimistic, and we should try to be more hopeful. But after days of struggle, and after like doing so much and being beaten down again and again, it's very difficult to feel any kind of hope. So feeling this kind of, oh, it's all going to end now is very normal. It's very like likely to happen to people, and it's very understandable. But Wade Walker rode out the storm, and by the morning of January 6th, with the wind easing, I tried to get a reading on the second. But somehow Wade Walker makes it out to another storm, and they make it to January the 6th. The wind eases, and Gordon goes and checks this instrument called the sextant, which is used to measure distances. Back in the chart room, I worked on wind speed, changes of force, drift, and current in an effort to calculate our position. The best I could determine was that we were somewhere in 150,000 kilometers of ocean, looking for a 65-kilometer wide island. He goes back to the chart room, which is the navigation place, and he does a lot of calculations there, right? And what is he calculating? He's trying to figure out where they are. Generally, like they plot their directions, they figure out where they're going to go, and then they set sail, and if all goes well, then they'll just follow the plan that they made when they were on land, right? But here, the issue is that they've gotten into a couple of storms. They don't know where they've gone, which direction they've gone in, how fast the wind has moved them. So a lot of unpredictability has changed their course of like the trajectory of their journey. Now he's like thinking about, oh, this is the speed of the wind. These are all the changes of course, which is like the changes of direction. The drift and the current are the sea, how fast the sea has been, where the sea has taken them. So he's thinking about all of these things, and he's trying to use all of that to figure out where they are in the ocean right now. And the problem with the ocean is that there are no like identity like markers on the ocean, right? You don't have like street signs and things like that. And the ocean in one place looks not very different from the ocean in another place. Um, Ultimately, even though Gordon does a lot of calculation and spends time on figuring this out, the best he can figure out is that they're somewhere in a patch of ocean that is like 150,000 kilometers wide. That's like saying, oh, I'm somewhere in South India, and you don't know where exactly you are in South India. And the issue now is that they have to find Eel Amsterdam, and Eel Amsterdam is so small, it's only 65 kilometers wide. So in like South India, imagine like having to find one like particular 65-kilometer wide plot of land, and you don't know where exactly that like plot of land is. You don't know exactly where you are, so it's double the confusion. Yeah, that's distances. And we get an interesting characteristic here of the narrator, which is just really that despite the fact that repeatedly, there is so much to like bring him down and so many issues, so many obstacles, even now, even after like trying the best that he can, the closest he can come to figuring out an answer is still very far from any kind of an accurate answer. He's still trying. And it's a very interesting characteristic that like humankind shares in general. People still try, even when they're in extremely dire circumstances. And that in itself is something that's quite good. While I was thinking, Sue, moving painfully, joined me. The left side of her head was now very swollen and her blackened eyes narrowed to slit. She gave me a card she had. So Gordon is sitting there, he's thinking about all of this, and the last thing he thought is, oh no, the best I can do is really figure out only this much. This isn't that great. Our chances of making it to this island aren't really good either. And then Sue comes and sees him, and she's moving really painfully, which means that her injuries have clearly gotten worse. And we hear that her eyes like are so bruised that she can't really open them anymore, and the left side of her head is really swollen. And despite this, she gives him a card that she's made. On the front, she had drawn caricatures of Mary and me. Caricatures are, exaggerated drawings of people like big noses or big heads with the words, here are some funny people. Did they make you laugh? I laughed a lot as well. Um, she's saying here are some funny people about the drawings that she's made. Caricatures are also supposed to be funny drawings, right? We deliberately mock like the features of the people so that whoever is looking at the caricature will sort of laugh, being like, oh, look at that ear, or oh, look at that nose, or oh, look at that clothing, something like that. Something on the drawing is going to make you laugh because it's deliberately exaggerated in a way that's supposed to make you laugh. And so she's saying, oh, look, I've drawn like some caricatures and they're funny. And did they make you laugh? I laughed when I was drawing this. Inside was a message. Oh, how I love you. So this card is to say thank you and let's hope for the best. And so inside the card, she's written, I love you and thank you for everything and I hope for the best to come out of this situation. Somehow we had to meet. And Gordon sees the card and he's sort of like, we have to make it out of this alive. And this is sort of a repetition of the situation that we had with John and him, right? And what's really going on here? And Sue gives him this card. It's something that children do all the time. They like make you a card and they give it to you, and it's a way for them to like express something to you. It's like an affectionate gesture. And here there are two things that we're getting from this card. One is she's laughing, even in like this moment, and she's trying also to make her father laugh by drawing like these funny pictures for him. And inside she puts like her love, and she says, "Oh, I hope everything goes well." And both of this is really touching, right? In this moment, it's a really terrible moment. She could be thinking only about herself. She could be thinking, oh no, we're going to die. We end up in this really terrible position. My parents put me in this really terrible position because, like, they're the ones who decided to fail anyway. But instead, she's sort of saying, oh, I'm trying to make you laugh. Maybe you can laugh like I laughed when I was drawing this. I hope like I give you some sort of happiness in this moment. And hey, I want to let you know I love you. And maybe things will still work out. And this is affection, it's compassion, it's hope. All of it is in this card. And all of that sort of like makes Gordon very determined. He's sort of like, okay, okay, we'll make it out. So the kids were sort of becoming like this source of motivation for Gordon. And let's talk about that in a second. But let's also talk briefly about the contrast that we're getting between the way the adults are and the children are in this situation. The adults obviously have to like take responsibility for a lot of what work needs to be done, right? And they are doing that. But a consequence of all of that responsibility is that they're also like burdened by the responsibility and the prime emotion that we're getting from them in all of these paragraphs is this kind of desperation, worry, fear that everything's going to end. And from the children, we get a completely different sort of emotion. Part of it is because they don't have that kind of responsibility weighing down on them. But it also tells us something interesting about Sue and John that in this moment of like dire circumstances, they can think about other people and not themselves. They're just like, okay, if the worst happens, the worst happens, but let's hope the best happens. And hey, while we have some time left, let's maybe laugh a little bit. And so we get like the children being sort of this source of like hope in the story, and that also is partly what is driving Gordon on, right? Every moment he realizes that his children are still on board, his children are still full of hope, and his children are so young. Also, these moments like when they say, "Oh, we're not afraid to die if we can be together," it's very innocent. When Sue gives the card and says, "Oh, how I love you both," it's very innocent, and it's a reminder that both of these kids like sort of love their parents and depend on their parents. So all of that serves to like build together into a motive to push Gordon to try harder. I'm gonna check to see if you have any questions. Okay, I see no questions, so I think we can keep going on. I checked and rechecked my calculations. And because he decides that we somehow have to make it, he goes back, he looks at his calculations, he checks them and he rechecks them. We had lost our main compass and I was using a spare which had not been corrected for magnetic radiation. Magnetic radiation is something that happens in a compass when it's close to like iron objects, for instance, a ship, right? So when like it's going to be on a ship and things like that, they correct it so that it will still be accurate. But Gordon has lost the compass that they usually use. He's not deliberately lost it, of course, the way it has washed off. So he's using the spare, and the spare is something that they haven't corrected for magnetic radiation. And so, unfortunately, like there is a possibility that like some of the readings on the compass will be wrong. I made an allowance for this, but he keeps this in his mind. And another estimate of the influence of westerly currents which flow through this part of the Indian Ocean. So he, when he is making his calculations, he includes in his calculations the fact that there is some magnetic radiation that's going to be off. So he puts that in like his calculations, makes up for it, and he also estimates like what the westerly currents, which are a particular set of winds that flow through the Indian Ocean. Yeah, he also estimates how like he tries to calculate how they will affect the speed of the ship. About 2 p.m., I went on deck and asked Larry to steer a course of 185 degrees. If we were lucky, I told him with conviction I did not feel, he could expect to see the island at around 5 p.m. At 2 p.m., Gordon goes back up and he tells Larry, who is now at the wheel, okay, steer at this particular degree. If we're really lucky, then we'll see the island at 5 p.m. And when he says this to Larry, he says it with conviction. Conviction meaning that he is certain of what he's saying, but he also tells us that he didn't feel that conviction. So he's taking it so that other people at least will like not feel terrible. So he's sort of pretending that he's very shocked and very certain. Then with a heavy heart, I went below, climbed down my bunk, and amazingly dozed off. When I woke, it was 6 p.m. and blowing back. He's feeling very heavy, he's feeling very uncertain, and he goes down and he goes to his bed and he surprisingly falls asleep. And when he wakes up, it is a full hour after the hour that we were supposed to see the island. It's 6 p.m., dark outside. I knew we must have missed the island, and with the space we had left, we couldn't hope to beat back into the westerly. And he is convinced that they've missed the island because why would they still be on the ship if they've reached the island? Why would somebody not have come and woken him up and taken him off the ship if they've reached the island? It's 6 p.m. already and it must be too late. They must have missed the island. And he's sort of also sure that with the sail that they have left, which is that small storm sail that they can use, they can't like fight against the wind and go back in the direction in which they come. The sail can't take back. It can't like carry them far enough. And so he's sort of like, okay, it's done. We're done for. A couple of words. Yeah, conviction I did not feel. Just covering up uncertainty, which he said. Amazingly, he says, amazingly, I don't stop, which means he's very surprised that in such a situation, under such immense stress, he somehow still falls. At that moment, a tousled head appeared by my bunk. Tousled is the hair is ruffled. Can I have a hug? Jonathan asked. Sue was right behind him. Both the children show up and they're like, we want a hug. Why am I getting a hug now? I asked. And Gordon's like, why am I getting a hug? Because he can't understand why he's getting a hug because he thinks he has fully like misdirected the ship and led them in the wrong direction and that, they haven't reached the island successfully, so he fully thinks he doesn't deserve a hug at this point in time. Because you're the best daddy in the whole world and the best captain, that's underlined. And Jonathan's like, you're the best dad and you're the best captain and that's why you're getting it. Not today, John, I'm afraid. And Gordon is in the midst of despair, so he's sort of like, oh, I am not the best dad dad in the world, probably the best captain today. And he's conflating two things, right? He's like, oh, I'm not the best captain today, and he thinks that because he thinks they've not reached the island, and that makes sense. Um, Even though he tried very hard, he failed, and so he feels like he's not the best captain. But he also feels like he's not the best father because he has also failed his children, right? And they are all probably going to die, and he feels terribly responsible. So he feels not only like a bad captain, but also like a bad father. Why you must be, said Sue, matter of fact. You found the island. What? I shouted. Out there in front of us, they told him, as big as a battleship. And Sue's like, no, you are the best father and the best captain. You found the island. And Gordon is entirely shocked. He shouts, what? And both the children tell him, it's right there, it's in front of us, big as a battleship. So we reach almost the very end of the story, and it's the children who, conclude the crisis. They're the ones who give us this good news, and in one way, it's extremely appropriate because all throughout the story, it's the children that have kind of pushed Gordon and given him that sort of encouragement and spirit required to like keep going and keep trying. Another interesting thing that we got is that comparison actually between the island and the battleship, which is interesting because they're comparing this island, which is going to be the source of their salvation, to a battleship. Without this island, they probably have died, and they're comparing it to a ship. And this is interesting because they've been on a ship all this time, and the ship has been like the biggest source of their worries, right? They've been afraid that the ship will sink and they'll die. But also, the ship is what has brought them to this safety. So all of that, like, connotation of safety in a ship, like, comes across in the fact that the island is being compared to a ship. Also, I rushed on deck and gazed with relief at the stark outline of sea. It was only a bleak piece of volcanic rock with little vegetation, the most beautiful island in the world. Gordon rushes to the top of the ship and he looks outside and he sees the outline of the island and he is immensely relieved. And he looks at it and it's a piece of volcanic rock, which means that the soil isn't like very good for things to grow on and it doesn't have a lot of vegetation, a lot of shrubs or anything like that. Um, but he looks at it and he sees the most beautiful island in the world. We anchored offshore for the night, and the next morning all 28 inhabitants of the island cheered as they helped us ashore. And for the night, we just stopped on the ship. They just put the ship like to shore there, and they stay on the ship. And the next morning, the people of the island, of which there are 28, all sort of cheer for them and help these people onto the island. And they're cheering for them as an expression of like support and sort of like awe, as a way to like say, we're so impressed that you made it and we're so glad that you're alive and we're incredibly happy that you made it to us. This place is really interesting. He looks at this island and he describes it as something that, has absolutely nothing on it for any of them to appreciate. But he still finds it incredibly beautiful. And that's because they're saved, and so that fact gives the narrator, gives God a lot of relief, and that relief makes the island feel beautiful. With land under my feet again, my thoughts were full of Larry and Herbie, cheerful and optimistic under the dynasty, and of Mary who stayed at the wheel for all those crucial hours. So they're back on land, they're back on stable ground that's not going to just, um, turn into sudden waves that like crash on them. And now Gordon is finally thinking about things other than having to save the ship. He's thinking about the people who were around him. He's thinking about Larry and Herbie, who were cheerful even though they were under like terrible stress. He's thinking about Mary, who steered the wheel in many important moments, especially that time when he had to go and pump like the water out of the ship. Most of all, I thought the 7-year-old girl, who did not want us to worry about the head injury, which subsequently took 6 minor operations to remove a all, the people that he thinks about when he is faced again are his children. Um, and we'll talk about things that he said about them. But first, the first thing that we see here is that when he's saved, he finally starts thinking about the role that all the other people around him have played in bringing all of them to safety. And the people that he thinks about the most are his children, because they've been, as we already talked about, sort of the heart of the story, right? Sort of the motivation behind Gordon carrying on. And he describes to us Sue and John in two specific ways. About Sue, he tells us that she didn't want them to worry about a head injury, and he tells us that that head injury eventually took like 6 operations to fix like the blood clot that had like occurred because of her thumb. Um, and that shows us that it's actually an incredibly serious injury, right? But what's important is that even though it's extremely serious, students want them to worry about it. And so the showcase is empathy and consideration, which were a sort of bright light and a moment of like affection that Gordon had in the even in the middle of the crisis. And another thing that he tells us is about Jonathan, who was not afraid to die, which was yet another moment that um, Gordon feels pushed to like try a little bit harder. And so we come to the very end of the story, and then we hit the end of the story, we end with the boy who's turned into the title of our story. That's the end of the story, but a couple of themes. We've spoken about most of this, so I'll be very brief. We get nature and human beings, the relationship between them, the sort of unpredictability of nature. We get the sort of situation in which human beings are battling to survive against the kind of fierce power of nature and the sort of helplessness of human beings in the face of that power. And yet, at the same time, these human beings make it out alive, right? And that brings us to our second point, which is a situation of crisis and how adaptability, improvisation, and determination and trying really hard can go a long way towards bringing us out of this crisis. So this text is sort of like a little manual on how to deal with crisis. Um, and one of the most important things in dealing with this crisis is what is at the heart of this, the title of this story, right? That ability to take support from others and ability to take heart from others. Um, in this situation, one of the prime reasons that Gordon finds that he can carry on is because of his children, and that shows us that it's possible for us to like find some sort of strength to keep going because of other people around us who love us. And we also see in the words of Johnson, who says, "We're not afraid to die if we can be together." That togetherness can prevent fear from taking over you. And so this sort of hope in collectivity, hope in community, and hope in love and affection and um, that sort of togetherness again. Um, yeah, that's ultimately what we can get from this. That brings us to the end of this lesson. I know it's a bit of a frustrating lesson, but I hope this has somewhat helped you grapple with the lesson a little. Um, Thank you for being here and listening to me. Before you leave, I just want to tell you like a couple of quick things. First is that there is this thing called a combat scholarship that is currently ongoing at Unacademy. Um, it is a scholarship test that can win you scholarships worth up to 1 crore. It is just a 45 minute test and it is absolutely free of cost. All you have to do is go sign up for it using the link in the description box below. And if you take the test, then you have the chance of getting a lot of money basically, and you also get quite a bit of revision in, and there is no loss because it's 45 minutes of time, and you won't really have to do anything for it other than just show up and do it. Take advantage of this opportunity. The link is in the description box below. You should also take advantage of everything that the Unacademy Learners app has to offer. You can find it on Google Play Store and on the Apple App Store. You can download it for free and you can try all of the features on it for free if you use my code, which is CHAR01. One of the coolest features on it is this Ask the Doubt feature on which you can basically like ask any doubts that you have and get them clarified from Educator. So take advantage months to that, if you have questions and you're not sure about certain concepts or there's something in specific that you really need help with, there are also other features that Unacademy offers, which are for some money. Unacademy Plus is one of the subscription facilities of Unacademy. It offers access to a lot of courses, a lot of classes like the ones they have on YouTube, but a lot more expensive. They cover the syllabus a lot more thoroughly. They have study material that they'll give you a lot more practice tests, a lot more live tests. This is a bunch of things that Unacademy Plus has available for you. Um, Unacademy Plus is these are the subscription costs for Unacademy Plus, and you can see that the price varies based on how long it takes subscription for, but it's a lot less if you take it for a lot longer. There's also something called Unacademy Iconic, wherein you can study on your own with the support of a teacher, which means that you won't be with another group of people. You'll be working alone with an educator to sort of see what's going on and figure out what you're good at, what you're not good at, kind of work on things that you struggle with the most, and you can pay attention and you get like complete focus on you, right? So you get a lot of intense support there. You also get like weekly reports that tell you how you're doing. It can track your progress for you, and your parents can also be in touch with educators to find out how you're doing. Unacademy Iconic has all of these pricing. Again, different durations of time that you can subscription for, but again, the per month cost is a lot less. You can subscription for a lot longer. So both these things again, you can use my referral code for a flat 10% discount. My code is also in the description box below. And those are just some of the features that Academy is currently offering right now. Thank you for being with me today on the Unacademy channel on YouTube. If you like today's session, then please do leave a like, share it around with people if you think that they will benefit from it, and definitely, please leave me comments if you have questions, if you have any sort of doubts, or if you have any sort of feedback. I'd be very happy to hear from you. And definitely subscribe if you're looking for more content like this, because we're making it for you all the time.